Hi, this is Wes Simpson, founder of LearnIPVideo.com, and I'm here today representing AIM, Alliance for IP Media Solutions. And with me is Kevin Salvidge. And Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself and your role at Leader?
Hello there. I'm the European Regional Development Manager for Leader, based in London in the UK. And many of you will have seen me, obviously, during the current lockdown on various social media channels, talking about Leader's products and technologies in IP and HDR.
So Kevin, tell us a little bit about what Leader has been doing in terms of IP product enhancements, creating tools that people that are doing all IP productions need in order to make their systems run better. What exactly does Leader add into that mix?
Right from the beginning, when we first kind of looked at IP, going back 6, 7, 8 years, the company made quite a clear distinction that the IP side of this is kind of the physical infrastructure layer, yet the color management of the picture stays the same. And that's pretty much been the same case throughout our industry as we've evolved from analog through serial digital. IP is just kind of the next evolution of the transport layer that we're putting this on, and the color management tools stay the same. So we made a real conscious effort right at the beginning of this that the tools that people are familiar with today, if they're working in a serial digital environment, should be the same tools they look at. So the waveform, the vector scope, the force color display. As we now move into high dynamic range, we've added the CIE color chart, because as we were talking a few minutes, we've got a new color space to play with here. And people have made fantastic TV programs for many years using those tools. So why throw them away? Let's move them onto the next infrastructure. And as lots of our customers are making the migration through, it's a phase migration. They're going through a hybrid environment where some of their feeds are SDI, some of it's IP. So we have a product with our waveform monitors and rasterizers that can display both IP and SDI simultaneously, because one of the big challenges we still see is that transition from IP to SDI and back again, because we have different references with black and burst and PTP. And if they're not all timed together, you have problems. So you need in one box a tool that can look at both IP and SDI signals, black and burst and PTP, but also give you something that you're familiar with.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. We're seeing a lot of people that are making the transition, but they don't want to get rid of all their existing infrastructure. They don't want to have to take every piece of equipment that they have and throw it away or whatever. So yeah, having a hybrid support makes a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit about HDR, kind of the freight train on the horizon that's barreling towards us. Where do you see HDR today in your customer base? How are they making it, making the transition, making it something that's a reality for consumers?
So as most consumers are aware, the HDR preserve at the moment is pre-recorded post-production content. Now we have seen a number of marquee events move into the kind of HDR live production. Probably the first mainstream was the FIFA 2018 World Cup, where FIFA actually produced all 64 games, and they offered their rights holders the ability to take it right the way from standard definition SDR right the way through to UHD wide color gamut HDR. And I think it's no secret that when they first talked about doing a UHD HDR service, they thought it would be more of the braver earlier adopters wanting to record it, to test it, but they ended up with over 24 rights holders taking that service, and many of them broadcasting that live.
Wow.
So, they probably won't admit, I think they were just taken aback a bit that suddenly the demand for this. And obviously, you know, that had its challenges, and that we now move on. I was looking at, you know, the last Super Bowl earlier this year. That had 13 mobile production vehicles there, over 100 cameras. If you're going to do these marquee events that people expect you to do in HDR, that requires some serious effort from broadcasters and production companies to make that happen. And that's where they're scratching their heads at the moment, that to do it with traditional SDI systems either means you quarter the power of your truck by using 4 times 3G. Do you invest in a new truck with 12G SDI when that's sort of going against what, you know, the general thinking is? Or IP does open up that ability, especially with, you know, the 25 gig products now being pretty much commonly available, to work in UHD.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that you know, going from having multiple cables to a single cable is always a good thing. Going from copper to fiber optics is always a good thing. And a lot of these IP switch vendors are really jumping on the bandwagon, you know, with you know, lots more than 25 gig interfaces. You're seeing a lot of 100 out there, and I've seen some 400 stuff making its way to the market. So that's really changing the way all this plumbing works.
Yeah, I mean, I think the great thing is we're now seeing 25 gig as an end mode where probably 10 gig was 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the first implementations were basically HD solutions, but now, as we expected, the COTS machine has brought the price of 25 gig down.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, looming in the background, you know, in Japan and that, you've got 8K now. Does that fall into 40 gig, 50 gig, or 100? You know, I think the industry's still not sure where that one's going. 40 gig, you know, always seems to be superseded in the data center world, because obviously it's based on 10 gig. Is 50 gig the one? Do we just go to 100? You know, this is the challenge our industry faces, that, you know, we're riding on a train that's moving fast.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. So you had some presentation material put together for us to go through some of the the challenges, and in particular, I'm really interested to understand how we're going to keep our current viewers on the air who only have SDR capability, and blend that
Sure.
with the folks that are going to be doing HDR.
Sure. Well, let's just pull up the slides. We'll do a
Sure.
little bit of positioning about HDR, but
Okay.
don't run away scared. So what is high dynamic range, and why is it so important to us? So high dynamic range is rapidly establishing itself as one of the most important new technologies to emerge in the broadcast industry for a number of years. You know, you can't walk into a department store and look at a consumer television without high dynamic range being mentioned. OTT companies are promoting HDR. It's coming at you left, right, and center. But where this is different, this hasn't come from like a single manufacturer. This is a series of technology innovations. And most of them have come because of the evolution in display devices. Because for years as broadcasters, we've been restricted by the limitations of the display device that the content, you know, is displayed on. So whilst the cameras have evolved and their dynamic range has increased at a rapid rate of knots, the display devices have pretty much stayed the same and failed to keep pace. That is until the advent of ultra high definition displays. And with them, we now have a new challenge, because when we moved from SD to HD, the way we made television programming stayed the same. The video transfers didn't change because they were all based upon the old CRT displays. And again, it was that important thing of, although we're producing something new, it still had to look good on the legacy products for customers who hadn't upgraded. But as a result of these limitations, you know, all high definition transfers were created using 8-bit video depth, 709 color space, and a peak brightness of 100 nits. And lots of people are shocked that we didn't change when we went to HD, but that's where we kept it. But with the new UHD displays now, we're looking at 10-bit depth, we're looking at a wider color space. And the final aspect of this is the introduction of high dynamic range, which means we can use a peak luminance much higher than 100 nits to create these transfers. And once you've seen HDR images, you can't unsee them. Everything else looks flat, it looks lifeless, it looks dull. And that's the challenge we face. If you watch one channel and they're showing it in HDR and you switch over to the other, where are you going to migrate to watch your future programming?
Well, we had the same thing take place when we went from standard def to high def. I remember the first time I saw an HD live production at the local electronics broadcaster. You know, I wouldn't ever want to watch hockey on standard def ever again.
And again with this, I mean, when we moved that, there were lots of people producing in high definition, but it was being broadcast in standard definition and it looked better. And you've got exactly the same going on here now, capturing in 4K wide color gamut HDR, but broadcasting in HD standard dynamic range, it looks better. Even though you're not taking advantage of all the features, it still looks better.
Sounds like a winner to me.
Yeah. So obviously, as I said, this has sort of been the preserve of the OTT providers. You know, that content has been recorded, most of it in a very traditional like film production manner. It's then gone into post-production, it's been edited, it's been graded. All the luxuries we don't have in the world of live production. So the other bit to remember, obviously, is that the vast majority of broadcast production companies earn their revenue from the HD 709 SDR production. That's what's paying for you to be at that sporting event, at that concert. That's what they're paying you for. But talk to the broadcasters, they're all going in the back of their mind, yeah, this 4K, wide color gamut, HDR, we're aware of it. You know, if you could record it and we can archive it for future deliverables, that's great for us. So HD SDR is currently 1080, 50 or 60i in a 709 color space.
Or 5994 if you're really suffering.
Yeah. I accommodated the North American by putting 60i in there.
There you go.
Obviously, we then move into the world of 4K and UHD. And for those who haven't explored this, there is no interlaced in the world of 4K and UHD.
Thank goodness.
It's all progressive. So if you want to wind somebody up, send them go and look for a 4K interlaced standard. Keep them quiet for a couple of hours.
I hope that never happens. I'm happy with progressive.
Yeah. But obviously, we also have a new color space, Rec 2020, which is a lot wider than BT 709. So as we went through when we played with 3D production, it's just not cost effective to have two trucks at a venue, two production teams, one producing SDR, one producing HDR. They both have to be produced at the same time. And the challenge is, how do we do that? When you've got to bear in mind that you've got 4K UHD and HDR, and then you've got HD, 1080i, SDR, and obviously 1080p in HDR. So there's quite a few challenges here. And in the next slide, we'll try and explain how we're approaching those. So as we discussed earlier, the transition from SDI to IP means that this is now actually feasible, because, as I said, you can quarter the power of your truck by using 4 times 3G. You don't really want to go to 12G because that's sort of defeating the object of where the industry is going. And obviously, if you do go to IP, as you can see here, with a 100 gig network connection, you can handle up to 75 1080p streams, and they're full duplex. They go both ways, whereas SDI was one going one way. So suddenly, with IP, this simultaneous HDR and SDR production, 4K and HD, becomes feasible. So if we take a look at how the world sort of works today with SDR, and it's quite simple really, because every device on the network is the same aspect ratio, it's the same frame rate, it's the same dynamic range, and it's the same color space. And we've done this for years. But when we move to the world of HDR, we've got to preserve what's known as the look of the picture, because we now have a lot more control over it. And the look implies a color saturation and image tone. And productions spend a lot of time and money to create that look and feel. Major brands like the NFL, like over here, the Premier League football, that brand and that look is important, and therefore it can't be compromised by playing around with the color space and the colors that it looks like. So converting image color space and luminance will have a significant effect on the look, and that's where the big challenge is in this new world. And you'll hear the term artistic intent, and that sort of goes hand in hand with the look. And it's the way that the producer and the director expect that image to look in both a high dynamic range and standard dynamic range. So when we move to a UHD HDR live production, as you can see, now we've got a lot more challenges. Like it or not, there are going to be legacy devices in the production that are either standard definition or 709 standard dynamic range color space, and you have to manage those.
Absolutely.
I would say the big challenge, we just talked about artistic intent and look and feel, graphics generation. People will spend millions of dollars on creating their company, their brand look, and going through this process, you can completely change the look of that brand if you don't do this correctly. So one of the big challenges we see at the moment are character generators, because unlike the cameras, which most of them have the ability to output both standard dynamic range and high dynamic range simultaneously, these devices are just set to one range. It's very, there are some, but not many at the moment, that have the ability to do both. So what we sort of look at is a conversion process that brings everything into the production switcher in the same standard. As I mentioned, you're going to have external feeds out there that may well be archive content. If you're doing a sports event, you might want to show this game 20 years ago, here's the matchup, you know.
Right.
And it's probably even going to be 4:3 just to add to the fun of it. But, you know, you've got to take that into account. So, as I said, you've got to be bear in mind these types of devices. And then you've got to look very carefully at the conversion devices. And this is currently where there's a lot of work going on in this field, because what you really need to do is to make sure that your vision engineers, your camera shaders, when they're adjusting the cameras, what they're delivering out here is what you expect to see. So somebody once described to me, working with high dynamic range is like squeezing a balloon full of water with your hands. When you squeeze it, it comes out in different directions, and it comes out at different heights and that, depending on the thickness of the rubber of the balloon. It's not linear. And that's why there are companies in our industry that, you know, have some very complex products that do, you know, a fantastic conversion job. So you need to look at those. But as I said, IP is the enabler, because we can get into this production switcher rather than having hundreds and thousands of SDI cables and then the same going out the back here. But the key thing here is to work in one format, whether that be S-Log3, hybrid log gamma, or even PQ, but make sure everything works in that, and then you can go back to delivering your standard dynamic range, your HDR, and all the variants that our broadcasters ask for these days. So as said, you know, at Leader, what we've tried to do is retain the tools like the vector, display, scope. Obviously, we've added now the CIE color chart. So everything you're familiar with from an SDI world of operation, you know, exists today. But what we've also done is added tools to our Cinezone false color display feature set, which now also work with high dynamic range. And as you can see on this image here, we have the false color display. Now, when you're covering sporting events, pretty much everybody sets the grass to 18%. That's your kind of reference level. And we found in sports productions and that your 90% reference for your kind of boundary between SDR and HDR needs to be something that's consistent across, you know, the whole field of play. And what we found during the FIFA World Cup was that we could actually use the white pitch markings and set that as a 90% reference, because the vision engineers were highlighting that pretty much in every frame there is going to be a line of pitch marking somewhere. And obviously this would lend itself ideally to American football because, you know, there's markings all over the pitch. So as you can see here on the false color display, you've got the white line behind this player's head is just starting to appear in blue, which means that's the boundary between standard dynamic range and high dynamic range. And then with the tools, with the false color display, anything that's purple on the picture means an HDR display is going to clip the image. You've overdriven it. Because HDR isn't just about maxing out the luminance and that. The real clever and the real artistry with HDR is working with the colors in the midtones, bringing them alive, because that really gets the audience, and that it's, you know, that's where the wow factor is in this. And, so, you know, with tools like this, you've got the waveform, so you can see where your signal sits as you would do with a traditional standard dynamic range image. You've got the vector display, so you know where the colors are sitting. Then you have the CIE color chart, which shows you how the colors, the luminance component is sitting within the color space. And then you've got that final confidence that the picture hasn't got any areas that are like hotspots that are going to be clipped on an HDR display.
So Kevin, do the current standards within ST2110 and in the AIMS roadmap, do they fully support all the things that are needed for 4K, UHD, HDR production, or are there some things that need to be worked on some more?
Well, I mean, the interesting bit we're seeing in SDI is the use of the payload IDs. That information now is becoming more widespread in SDR productions, that pretty much all of the camera manufacturers can now output what bit rate, what transfer characteristic they're using, what color space, which means devices like ours, you switch on the payload ID and it automatically configures itself to what the payload ID is. That's something, obviously, in the 2110 world, as part of the ancillary data in Dash 40, you know, we've got to make sure it's there, because if people, things they take for granted in the SDI world are not there in IP, they're going to wonder, well, what's the benefit to me in my production? So they're kind of the key pieces.
So is work going on in that area? Is that something that you're participating in at all, or?
Well, certainly as leader on the latest generation of software for our waveform monitors and rasterizers, we now can take in an IP signal, output it as SDI on our box, and insert the ancillary data information that's been put in there. So we could switch, you know, a downstream monitor if it can understand the payload ID to its color space, its HDR transfer characteristic. It's really just making sure that everybody who's involved in the whole chain understands the value of this data that's being put in there. Because in the SDI world, it wasn't uncommon for people just to blank the vertical interval. And all that effort is wasted, it's gone.
Right. Yeah, that certainly is a radical change, particularly when we start talking about things like compression, et cetera. So where do you see production going, in terms of HDR for native compression inside the production truck, if you will, lorry, whatever, the OB van, or versus compression at the source versus compression at the destination? Is that something that requires some special care?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, we're living in a COVID world. You and I are talking to each other because we're not in New York. We're not meeting face to face.
Right.
And this has had the same impacts, on, live production. Our governments have, in some cases, forced the sporting authorities to continue on with their schedules because of the public morale, the boost, to see your team play basketball, baseball, or football, or soccer, whatever it is. But then obviously, production companies have the challenge that they can't put 300 people in a venue, when there's a maximum of 300 people, and that includes the players. How do we do this? So, IP production, 2110 has enabled a number of companies to look at doing this remotely, back to a centralized production center. I think anybody will admit that this was very much in its infancy. People were trying it. Some people had done it with just graphics. Some people had done it with replays. We were finding our way, and then COVID came along, and we've sort of had to rush to get this to work. We've kind of seen, talking to people, that those first generation systems were put together to satisfy the SLA to their rights holders. Get me that content on air, and we'll worry about it in the future. Now they've proved it works, which I think is a great testament to 2110 and all the work that everybody's been doing, that it worked. But now these companies are saying, well, it works. Let's start bidding for new tenders. And the engineers are sort of looking, going, oh, that was a one-off. It's not very elegant. We need to look at what are the second generation products. Now, you've mentioned there compression. Obviously, 2110 has a whole section on compression that's, if it's not already there, it's coming very soon. That does provide us with challenges that these devices have to sort of decode them, and there's a lot of horsepower required in some of these compression algorithms that are being used. So that's going to be interesting to see. I think to start with, we will retain uncompressed 2110 as being like the default for how we do this. But obviously, as more and more products move towards software-based solutions, it's going to enable that use of compression, and I think it's going to open up the ability to produce high quality content at events that previously could not have afforded us to be there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the long-term trends in the industry are, wider selection of content, a broader array of venues, more inclusive, if you will. And I think that HDR is going to be something that becomes run of the mill. But when do you see that happening? Is that something that's going to be within the next few months, or is that going to be a multi-year process? Or, how? I mean, obviously for the large events, HDR today. But
yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see in Europe here that we are seeing some of the major football soccer leagues now, like in Germany, the Bundesliga is broadcasting at least 1 or 2 matches a weekend in HDR. You're starting to see them chip away at it now. I think it probably would have happened quicker if if COVID wasn't around, I think we would have seen this accelerate a lot quicker. I think a lot of the engineering resources have been sort of moved into making this IP remote piece work. But HDR is certainly there because, you know, in Europe here, we've already seen Amazon come in and acquire the rights for the US Open tennis. It acquires some of the Premier League football. It's showing that in HDR. If they're showing it and the traditional broadcasters are not, as I said earlier, you know, people will vote with their feet. They'll go to the channels that have the more compelling content, and HDR is compelling.
So are you a HDR viewer at your favorite viewing location?
I am, yes, I am signed up to a number of the OTT services. I'm encouraged to see here in the UK, Sky, who probably have the largest number of set-top boxes into people's homes, have been carrying the Netflix offering, and that is now available in HDR this month in the UK. So it's coming.
That's a real step forward. I mean, that's gonna drive a lot of interest in HDR.
It is. I mean, there's the other piece about HDR is HD HDR. Now, obviously, there's a lot of interest in that because production is a lot simpler. You can use existing 3G infrastructure, and also you can use existing kind of transmission contribution circuits for it as well. So that one's bouncing around in the background, and because you've gone from 1080i to 1080p, you've got an increase in resolution, you know, from that as well. So you've got a lot of broadcasters, especially in Europe, looking at that kind of going, I need a UHD service as my premium brand, but does it make more sense to keep the rest HD but move them to HDR? You know, that's the questions being asked at the moment out there. And that's just another one of those deliverables that, you know, a live production company might be asked to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some pretty compelling evidence that says a 1080p HDR signal, even if you have to upconvert it to fill your 4K television, is still a big step forward from where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken with some customers who were very early launching HD services, so they were 720p. They then tested out 1080i and had lots of complaints because that progressive versus interlace scanning.
Oh yeah. The
consumer can see it. Interesting, if you go from I to P, they don't see it. So, you know, it's a big enabler. You know, we described it earlier. This is a freight train coming. You know, it's getting increasingly difficult on Amazon and Netflix to find content that is not HDR. You know, the other channels are going to have to catch up because, you know, it's a dog eat dog world out there.
Right. Survival of the fittest. Absolutely.
Especially as a lot of us are kind of sitting at home at the moment. You know, we're not traveling. We're looking for content, new exciting content to watch.
Right, and no more fun going to the movie theater either. So yeah, we need some good stuff at home.
Yeah.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much for your time today. I think you've given us a good overview of some of the challenges of doing HDR production, UHD HDR production, and it sounds like without IP, this is a much bigger hill to climb. Is that right?
I would say so. I'll go back to a quote I had from a customer 3 years ago at a Champions League final in Cardiff, where one company turned up with one single IP truck. And the comment was 3 years ago, "Ooh, are they a bit brave?" And somebody said, they may be, but they've got one truck here. We've got three. Look at the economics of it. You know, they've got 60 people. We've got 200. You know, use that term, wake up and smell the coffee. It's coming.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today.
No, thank you very much. As ever, it's great to talk to you. And if anybody has any questions on this or any other, the HDR pieces from Leader, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Very good. Thank you so much.